My name is Andrea Perry. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the responsible one, the steady one, the problem solver who kept everything stitched together in a family that didn't really notice who was doing the stitching. I lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment about half an hour from my parents' house, close enough to get there quickly, far enough to pretend I had boundaries. I worked full-time as a remote IT consultant, which meant I could pay my bills, support myself, and most importantly, in my parents' eyes, be available. And for the last 5 years, being available became my entire identity. Doctor appointments pharmacy runs grocery drops, covering the bills when their Social Security couldn't stretch another inch. I did it all without complaint, or at least without expressing the complaints aloud. If my family had a golden child, it was my younger sister Melody, 31, radiant, impulsive, and beloved in a way I never quite understood. She changed life plans the way some people changed outfits. Fashion design in LA, yoga in Oregon, a vegan bakery dream in Austin, a spiritual retreat phase in Sedona. She spun through identities like a carousel, each one more temporary than the last, while I held the ground beneath her. And still our parents adored her. They always had. Even when she vanished for months, even when she forgot birthdays or blew through their savings chasing some transformative experience, they defended her with a softness I never received. "She's just figuring herself out," my mother would say with a dreamy sigh, as if Melody were some philosopher searching for the meaning of existence, rather than someone who simply couldn't commit to anything for more than 3 weeks. I used to let it roll off me. I told myself I'd grown numb to favoritism, but numb and unaffected are not the same thing. I realized that slowly, the way you only notice water boiling once it's already too late. When Melody returned to town, temporarily, as she phrased it, living rent-free in a friend's spare room and documenting her reset era on Instagram, things at first seemed manageable. She'd pop into our parents' house with takeout snap, a few pictures of quality family time, and then disappear for days while I continued to do the real caretaking. I'd drop groceries on the counter, refill their pill organizers, pick up prescriptions, review their utility bills, and she would glide in just in time to comment. "Andrea, you're literally the most dependable daughter ever," in that syrupy tone that made admiration sound like condescension. Still, I kept my distance. Adults, I reminded myself, can coexist, even dysfunctional ones. But about a month after she'd settled back home, subtle shifts began creeping in. My father mentioned that Melody had offered to help organize paperwork. My mother started dropping hints like, "Your sister has grown so responsible lately. You should see how mature she's become." I remember blinking at that, trying not to laugh. Melody mature. A sudden transformation into the child they always hoped she'd be. I should have pushed for details. I didn't. I told myself it was easier to let my parents bathe in their illusions. Then came the rainy Thursday, the day everything cracked open. I stopped by after finishing a project early that afternoon. Dad was asleep in his recliner, snoring gently. Mom was fussing at the stove, humming an old song she used to play when we were kids. The air smelled like thyme and damp earth. Melody wasn't around, of course. I set a bag of apples on the counter, and as the magazine shifted beneath it, something slid into view. A cream-colored envelope, heavy paper, expensive. My name was on it, typed, not handwritten. That alone felt odd. My parents weren't formal people. Almost everything they wrote came with sloppy pen lines, and my mother's looping cursive. "I think dinner's almost ready," Mom chirped behind me, but her voice suddenly felt far away. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally. The envelope was simply there, addressed to me, so I opened it. Inside was a copy of my parents' will, and in that moment the kitchen air thickened, pressing against my chest as I scanned the lines once, then again, as if repetition would change the words. "To our beloved daughter Melody, we leave the family home and all its contents." There was no mention of me, not a split, not a token acknowledgement, not even a paragraph that said, "And to Andrea." Nothing. The house, the entire property, all of it was going to Melody. My fingers went cold around the paper. That house had been a second full-time job for me, shoveling the driveway in winter, mowing the lawn every weekend, paying to renovate the upstairs bathroom when a burst pipe flooded it 2 years ago. I'd poured time, money, and pieces of myself into maintaining it, and apparently none of it mattered. "Dinner's ready, sweetheart," Mom repeated in the background, but her voice sounded muffled, like I was submerged underwater. My heartbeat drowned everything else out. I slipped the will back into the envelope, placed it exactly where it had been, and forced myself to breathe evenly so my mother wouldn't hear the tremor in my chest. That night, I didn't confront them. I couldn't. Driving home, I held the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but the ache felt safer than the thoughts spiraling in my head. I told myself maybe it was a draft. Maybe they planned to revise it. Maybe they didn't understand how it looked. The word maybe was the only lifeline I had, even though, deep down, something in me knew I was lying to myself. The next time I visited them, I watched every detail. The way Melody smiled, just a little too brightly. The way my parents leaned toward her like sunflowers turning to light. The way conversations had shifted without me noticing. And I felt something inside me quietly detach. I didn't stop helping immediately, but I did begin to withdraw piece by piece. Less groceries, fewer rides, no more automatically paying their utility bills. I left them in the mailbox with a sticky note. Let me know if you need help with this. They didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't mention it. But the real unraveling, the moment everything that simmered beneath the surface began to boil, was closer than any of us realized. I didn't plan my withdrawal. It wasn't strategic or vengeful, not at first. It was more like turning down the volume on a radio that had been blaring for too long, a quiet adjustment subtle enough that no one should have noticed immediately. I went from weekly grocery refills to bi-weekly, from automatic bill payments to leaving envelopes on the counter with polite notes. I told myself I wasn't abandoning them. I was simply giving them the independence they'd always claimed they wanted. But the strange thing was how seamlessly they adapted to Melody stepping into the spotlight. It was like watching a play where I'd been the lead actor for years, only to suddenly find myself recast as an understudy. And Melody. She took the stage effortlessly, even though she didn't know a single one of her lines. She'd drift in with a latte, drop it on the table, and say things like, "Mom, don't worry. I'll help you with the paperwork later," in this breezy way that implied competence even when she had none. And my parents starved for this fantasy of the daughter they always wanted, ate it up. Meanwhile, I found myself watching them with a new kind of distance, as though our lives were unfolding behind glass. Each time I stopped by, I noticed how their attention slid past me toward Melody. Every time she appeared in the doorway wearing one of her flowy, spiritual boutique outfits and talking about aligning her intentions, my mother would beam, like she'd just discovered a long-lost treasure. But the moment when everything shifted from irritating to alarming came on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I was in the middle of a Zoom call when my phone buzzed. The notification preview showed a message from my mother, no greeting, no punctuation, just, "Do you know when the electric bill is due?" They sent a warning. I frowned. The electric bill had never been an issue. For years, it had auto-drafted from my account. Except, I'd removed my card 2 weeks earlier. Before I could type a response, another message popped up. Also, the grocery store declined my card. Can you check? Then a third, the one that made my stomach tighten. Melody said she thought you were still covering these things. That was it. The pattern clicked into place like a lock turning. Melody knew I'd seen the will. She knew I was pulling back. And instead of taking responsibility or explaining anything, she let our parents feel the discomfort and played dumb, letting the blame drift toward me. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Andrea must have forgotten. She's been so busy lately. You know how she gets with work. I didn't reply. Not yet. I needed time to absorb the implications. But the universe was not done hitting me that day. That evening, my father texted me from his phone, a rarity that immediately put me on edge. "We need $2,000 for rent, please." Rent. They owned the house they'd willed to Melody, the house I'd maintained for years. Why would they suddenly owe rent? Unless they'd taken out a reverse mortgage or some kind of emergency loan. Maybe at Melody's suggestion. Maybe to help her with something. Maybe my breath caught because there was no savings left. The thought made my entire body tense. I typed out a dozen possible responses and deleted them all. Finally, I settled on the only word I had the strength to send. No. I stared at the screen after hitting send, my pulse racing. Not out of anger, out of fear, out of grief. Out of the dawning realization that everything I'd done for years, every bill, every appointment, every late-night worry had meant nothing when put beside Melody's ability to smile and charm her way into their blind trust. Still, I hadn't yet fully processed just how deep the betrayal went. I hadn't connected all of the dots. That came later. First came the car. It was 2 days after the rent message. I'd just settled at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee when my phone rang. This time it was Dad calling, not texting, which instantly made my stomach drop. "Hey, Dad," I answered cautiously. "Andrea," he said, sounding oddly upbeat. "Got a favor to ask." Every cell in my body braced. "What kind of favor?" "Well, your sister's been helping us out a lot lately," he began, and that alone made me stiffen. So we figured she deserves a little break. A break from what I asked, though I already feared the answer. "Oh, just errands. Stress everything she's juggling right now," he replied. "She's been driving my car, but it's not in the best shape. We were thinking, well, maybe you could lend her yours for a few weeks." I nearly dropped my mug. "My car," I repeated slowly. "The one I paid off. The one I use." "You work from home," he said gently, as though explaining something obvious. "You don't need it as much. She's got job interviews coming up." "She doesn't even have a valid license in this state," I reminded him sharply. A hesitant pause. "She's working on that." I stared at the wall for a long moment. "Dad, you want me to give up my car so Melody can float around town for imaginary job interviews?" "Don't be like that," he said, tone tightening. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't try to explain my perspective. Instead, something inside me, something quiet, tired, and deeply wounded, finally broke. I hung up on him. No goodbye, no justification. I simply ended the call. And as soon as I did, everything inside me settled into an unexpected calm, a clarity, a certainty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time miscommunication. It wasn't something that would blow over and reset itself. This was a pattern, a choice, a truth that had been staring me in the face for years. I wasn't the daughter they relied on. I was the daughter they used. That night, I removed my payment information from their grocery delivery account. I called the pharmacy, transferred all prescriptions to a location closer to me. I suspended their auto pay, blocked Melody's number. Not out of revenge, out of survival. But even then, I didn't understand how close we were to the tipping point, how quickly the facade would crumble. And I had no idea that the next time we saw each other would end everything we'd ever pretended was family. For a few days after I cut off the automatic payments and blocked Melody's number, the silence in my life felt like someone had pressed a hand over a speaker that had been blaring static for years. At first it was disorienting, then strangely serene. I woke up without an immediate barrage of messages. I drank my coffee in peace. I went to work meetings without needing to leave abruptly to manage some crisis at my parents' house. For the first time in half a decade, my life belonged solely to me. But peace rarely lasts long in stories like mine. Still, there was one question that gnawed at me the will. The memory of that cream-colored envelope lurked in the back of my mind like a bruise I couldn't stop poking. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a draft. Maybe my parents didn't grasp how deeply unfair it felt. The tiny, hopeful part of me still wanted to believe it could be explained. But the bigger part, the clearer part, needed the truth. So one quiet afternoon, when the rain had paused long enough to leave streaks of silver drying across the pavement, I grabbed my keys and drove to the county records office. The building was exactly what I expected and exactly what I dreaded. Sour coffee smell, flickering fluorescent lights, the kind of waiting chairs that hurt your back after 5 minutes. Bureaucracy soaked into the walls like old smoke. The clerk behind the counter didn't look up as I approached. "Property deeds, wills," she mumbled mechanically. "Property records," I replied. "My parents' address." I slid my ID across the counter. "I am their daughter." She typed with 2 fingers, her long nails clacking loudly. A moment later, she disappeared into the file room. When she returned, she carried a manila folder thick enough to scare me. "Sign here," she said. My name looked strangely small on the form. She handed me the folder and pointed me to a dull green chair near the wall. When I opened it, the truth hit me hard enough to make my throat tighten. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't incomplete. The deed transfer for my parents' house was already processed as pending, scheduled to finalize within 3 months. The beneficiary listed Melody Perry. The will was there too, neatly signed, neatly notarized, filed just last month. Not a single clause referencing me. Not a single mention of an equal split. Not even a symbolic gesture. My parents hadn't forgotten. They had chosen. I didn't cry. I did not storm out. I didn't crumble in the way someone might in a movie. Instead, something in me went still, quiet, sharp almost, like an internal switch sliding into place. I'd always known deep down that favoritism had been the family's unofficial religion, but seeing it spelled out in legal language and government ink was a different kind of wound, one that cut clean. I closed the folder and sat there in silence for a long time. When I finally left the building, the sky had turned heavy again, clouds swollen with unspent rain. I drove home without music, without GPS, letting the quiet fill me until it almost felt like peace. But peace wasn't the right word. It was clarity. Clarity that I had been right to pull back. Clarity that I had never been valued the way I valued them. Clarity that something had to change, not in them, but in me. That night I made a list not of revenge, not of debts, but of boundaries. Real boundaries. Ones I should have set years ago. No more financial support. No more emotional scaffolding. No more picking up slack. No more being manipulated through obligation. No more rescuing people who never rescued me. The next morning, I woke up with a tension in my chest, but for the first time, it didn't feel like dread. It felt like awakening. And I began rebuilding myself. I cleaned my apartment top to bottom. I ordered a new desk chair, one that didn't leave my back stiff for days. I took myself out to lunch, an actual lunch, sitting by a window instead of eating leftovers between meetings. I even booked a therapy consultation. By the end of the week, I'd scheduled weekly sessions. The first session was harder than I expected. Years of swallowed resentment and silent sacrifices crashed through me like floodwater. But the therapist didn't flinch. She listened, asked questions, gently unraveled knots I didn't know I'd been carrying since childhood. And a strange thing happened, I cried. A lot. But the tears felt like rain on parched soil, necessary cleansing overdue. 2 weeks later, I did something that shocked even me. I booked a vacation. A short trip to the West Coast. Alone. No obligations. No guilt. Just space. For 5 days I hiked. I breathed ocean air. I ate meals, slowly savoring flavors instead of rushing through them. I woke up early to watch the sunrise and fell asleep without checking my phone for emergencies that no longer belonged to me. When I came home, I felt different. Not healed, not fixed, but stronger. More myself than I'd been in years. And with that strength, my mind returned to the documents I'd seen at the county office, specifically a line buried inside the deed transfer that didn't sit right with me when I first skimmed it. Subject to lien clearance and familial equity reconciliation. The phrasing scratched at my mind like a splinter. So I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Samir, an old college friend turned real estate attorney. He picked up after the second ring. Andrea, wow, long time. I need your help, I said. Something about my parents' property. And Melody. When I described the clause, I heard him shift his tone, sharpening. I've seen that language, he said. It usually means the property can't be fully transferred unless all family equity contributions are accounted for. In English, if you've put money into the house, repairs, renovations, anything significant, and there's a paper trail, you can contest the transfer, potentially delay it, even block it. I sat up straighter. Block it. Absolutely. Depends on what you can prove. My heart beat faster, not in vindictiveness, but in validation. I'd spent years paying for repairs, renovations, emergency fixes, and I had the receipts, the emails, the transfers, the invoices. So I said slowly, if I challenged the transfer, it would freeze automatically, he explained. The county can't finalize a deed under dispute. I closed my eyes, letting the truth settle. I had more power than I realized. This isn't about getting the house, I told him eventually. I don't even want it. I know, he replied. Then what do you want? I exhaled. The answer rose from somewhere deep inside me. I want acknowledgement. I want the truth recognized. I want closure. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, then let's get you exactly that. 3 days later, with Samir's guidance, I mailed a formal intent to contest notice to the county office. My hands didn't shake this time. And I thought that would be the end of it, that the dispute would quietly freeze the transfer and life would move on. But life never moves quietly in families like mine. Because 3 days after the county marked the deed as disputed, Melody made the biggest mistake she'd made yet. She listed the house for sale, and she had absolutely no idea what was coming. If there's one thing I've learned about Melody over the years, it's that she has an uncanny ability to look confident in situations where she has absolutely no idea what she's doing. It's almost a talent how she can bluff her way through life with a smile, a filter, and a perfectly timed hair flip. But even I wasn't prepared for the boldness of what she did next. 3 days after I filed the deed dispute with the ink barely dry on the county stamp, I received a DM from an old high school neighbor. Your parents selling the house didn't think you guys were moving. Attached was a screenshot. There it was, my parents' home, our childhood home, freshly listed on a real estate site. Front porch repainted a soft gray. Blossoming hydrangeas in the front yard. A wide-angle lens that made the entryway look twice as spacious as it really was. And underneath the photos, an iconically smug caption, shown by Melody Perry. Private appointments available. DM me for details. I stared at the screenshot long enough for my coffee to go cold. She hadn't just tried to sell the house behind my back. She had staged it, photographed it, and marketed it like she was a seasoned agent rather than an accessory to fraud. For a moment, I almost admired the audacity. Almost. Then my phone buzzed again with another message. Your sister's doing an open house this weekend. Did your parents finally decide to move to a condo? She looked so excited. Excited. The way only someone who believes they're untouchable can be excited. But here's the thing. Read-thin people like Melody, who rely on charm more than competence, never bother checking details like title flags or county disputes. Why would she? In her mind, the world aligned itself around her wants. Consequences were for other people. I called Samir within minutes. She listed the house, I said flatly. It's publicly posted. The pause on his end was heavy but unsurprised. She doesn't know about the dispute. Clearly not. He exhaled through his nose. Then she's in for a very rude awakening. Once the listing agent tries to run the title check, the freeze will show up. Everything will be halted. What do I do now? You wait, he said, and document everything. So I did, but I wasn't content with waiting alone. The neighbor who saw everything. I called one of my parents' longtime neighbors, Mrs. Albright, a woman in her 70s, who'd been friends with my mother for decades, but who always preferred me over Melody. She lived across the street in a little brick house with lace curtains and a garden full of lavender. Sweetheart, she said warmly when she picked up. How are you? Your mother mentioned you've been busy. I wasn't ready to unpack that mess, so I cut straight to it. Mrs. Albright, I need a favor. I need to know what's happening with the house. Are your parents okay? She asked immediately. They're fine, I replied, but Melody is trying to sell the house. Silence, then a choked laugh. Sell it. That girl, she can't even sell a used ottoman at a yard sale. I sighed. She listed it online. There may be an open house this weekend. Well, I could practically hear her rolling up her sleeves. I'll keep watch. Don't you worry, dear. Less than 48 hours later, she called again. Her voice was clipped urgent. It's happening, she said. They put up the sign this morning. Big white thing with balloons on it. And Melody's out there right now with some man in a tight jacket and skinny jeans. He keeps calling her babe while taking pictures of the front porch. I pinched the bridge of my nose. That must be the amateur agent she roped into this. He doesn't look very professional, she sniffed. He's not, I replied. I'll let you know if anything else happens. That woman deserves sainthood. The email that changed everything. I wasn't about to show up in person and cause a scene. Not yet. Melody was expecting resistance from me. She always did. Her brilliance was in assuming I'd fall into predictable patterns, confronting, arguing, getting emotional, giving up. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. I was playing mine. So instead of confronting her, I drafted a short, impeccably polite email to the real estate agent, Mr. Puit, according to the listing. Subject urgent title, dispute for 44, Sycamore Lane. Body. Dear Mr. Puit, I'm writing to inform you that the property located at 44 Sycamore Lane is currently under a formal title dispute filed with the county clerk's office. Please verify the deed status before proceeding with any sale listing actions or open house events. This message serves as official notice. Sincerely, Andrea Perry. I CC'd Samir for legal weight. Samir approved the wording. Very clean. Very unshakable. I almost felt sorry for the man. Almost. The explosion. The response didn't come from the agent. It came from Melody. From an unknown number because I had blocked her original one. What did you do? No greeting, no punctuation, just rage. A second message followed almost immediately. The realtor is saying something about the title being frozen. Why? Call me now. I turned the phone over, screen down on my kitchen counter. I didn't respond. 2 hours later, my mother texted me. Andrea, sweetheart, please call me. There's a problem with the house paperwork. Melody is very upset. I didn't respond to that either. I didn't have to. The wheels were already in motion. The listing was halted. The open house was canceled. The amateur agent realized he'd risked his license and stopped returning Melody's calls. The county flagged the property as under legal dispute. Everything she'd planned, her bragging rights, her victory lap, her influencer posts collapsed in a single afternoon. And the funniest part? She still thought that was the worst of it. She had no idea that while I'd been documenting her failed house sale, I'd also been digging into something far more explosive. Her financial past. Her deleted records. Her borrowed money. Her old Google Drive. And the secret she never expected anyone to find. But I did. And that was the moment Melody's entire facade began to unravel for real. When the house sale collapsed, Melody must have thought I was finished. In her mind, freezing the deed transfer was probably just another emotional overreaction from the jealous older sister who never liked seeing her shine. She reduced every boundary I set to bitterness. It was easier for her that way, easier than accepting any responsibility for the chaos she left in her wake. But what she didn't know was that the house wasn't the center of this storm. It wasn't even the strongest card I held. While she spent her days staging picture-perfect rooms and pretending to be a real estate expert, I had been quietly digging somewhere she never expected anyone to look the remnants of her old digital footprint. Years ago, back when she was chasing her first big entrepreneurial dream, she'd asked me to help her set up a shared Google Drive. She needed help with branding, spreadsheets, financial planning, all things she never understood but pretended she did. Eventually, that project fizzled out like all her others, and she moved on to her next reinvention. She probably assumed I deleted the shared folder, or she simply forgot it existed. But I hadn't forgotten, and the folder still belonged to me. It took me less than an hour to recover the archived link from my email, 20 minutes for every file to load, and maybe 60 seconds for my breath to catch in my throat. There, tucked beneath old invoice templates and logo drafts, was a series of financial documents, screenshots, scanned bank statements, transfer receipts. They looked like pieces of a puzzle Melody thought no one would ever bother assembling. One transaction stood out immediately, a $22,000 withdrawal from my parents' joint retirement account. Not a bank loan, not a credit line, their retirement funds. The memo attached to the transfer made my skin prickle. Temporary withdrawal for Melody's business launch. To be repaid by Q4. Do not tell Andrea. That last sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because I needed the money, not because they owed me anything financially, but because of the secrecy, because they'd deliberately hidden it from me while I was the one paying for their groceries, their medication, their winter repairs, their utility bills. I kept scrolling. 3 months later, another note in the account's log repayment written off. Melody too stressed. Treat as gift. A gift. They drained their own retirement to fund her latest fantasy, and they called it a gift. Meanwhile, I was the one covering their bills to prevent shutoff notices. I felt something shift inside me. Not fiery anger, not the explosive kind that bursts outward. No, this was a quieter, colder realization. A recognition of the truth I had avoided acknowledging for years. I hadn't been the dependable daughter. I had been the safety net, the silent bank, the plug for every hole in their sinking ship. And Melody. She wasn't just the golden child. She was a liability my parents willingly risked everything for. I sat there with those files open on my laptop, each one a tiny shard of betrayal. It didn't matter that Melody had failed those business ventures. What mattered was that my parents had depleted their own future to support her dreams, then leaned on me quietly constantly when the consequences hit. For the first time, I fully understood just how deeply the imbalance ran. I called Samir as soon as I gathered every screenshot, every log entry, every invoice I paid for repairs over the last 5 years. My voice didn't shake. My pulse didn't race. I was calm. Can we trigger a formal audit, I asked? Not just the deed dispute, everything. Every financial contribution, every disparity. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "With what you found, that audit won't just freeze the transfer, it could overturn it completely." "Good," I replied. "I'm not doing this to win the house. I'm doing it because this has gone on long enough." We filed the paperwork that afternoon. The audit was official. And that meant Melody was now legally obligated to disclose every financial detail tied to the property and to my parents. 48 hours later, the storm hit. My mother called first. She didn't even say hello. "Andrea, what is going on?" "Melody is hysterical. She says you're trying to ruin her life. Why would you file something so extreme?" "Because you took $22,000 out of your retirement and hid it from me. Because you gave her a house she didn't earn. Because you let me carry the weight of both your lives while telling her she was the son. Because I finally refused to be used." "But I didn't say any of that. I simply said the sale wasn't legal. The transfer wasn't either." Mom's voice cracked. "You didn't have to go this far." "No," I said softly. "You didn't have to push me this far." There was a long silence. For the first time in years, my mother didn't have a ready-made excuse or a soothing justification to offer. Dad tried calling next. I didn't answer. And Melody. She found a new number to text me from. The first message came in at 2:11 p.m. "Hope you're happy. You're destroying everything. You've always been jealous. Now everyone sees what you really are." I muted the number. I wasn't interested in defending myself in a narrative she'd already written. I had moved beyond anger. beyond guilt, beyond the desperate need to be understood. What mattered now was truth, and that truth, the financial imbalance of decades, was now a matter of legal record. Samir called the next morning. Her lawyer reached out, he said. Melody is folding. I felt myself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in months. What does that mean? I asked. It means she's giving up. She's relinquishing the transfer. And just like that, the house she thought she owned was slipping out of her hands. But this wasn't the end. Not yet, because Melody still had consequences waiting for her, consequences she never imagined she'd face. And I was ready to see them through. When Samir told me Melody was folding, I expected relief, maybe even vindication. But what washed over me instead was a strange, cool quiet, like standing in the eye of a storm I had been outrunning for years. The noise wasn't gone forever, not yet, but it had finally paused. And in that pause, I understood something important. This wasn't victory. Not at all. It was accountability. Finally. Belatedly. Clumsily. But undeniably accountability. Melody's lawyer tried to negotiate at first, of course. They always try negotiation before admitting defeat. They suggested partial reimbursement, suggested mediation, suggested that both parties have made emotional decisions which would have been hilarious if it weren't so predictable. They tried painting Melody as overwhelmed, fragile, sensitive, stressed. The usual script. Except I wasn't the Andrea of 2 months ago. I didn't bend. I didn't soften. I didn't offer a compromise to make everyone comfortable. I simply said no. Once they realized I wasn't moving, everything collapsed quickly. Melody was forced to relinquish all rights to the house transfer. The county voided the pending deed change. The property was no longer in legal limbo. It was simply not hers. And for the first time, Melody had to accept that her charm couldn't fix this. The backlash came fast. The real estate agent first. When the amateur agent, the man in the too-tight jacket who had been calling her babe, found out she'd lied about the house's legal status, he was furious. I didn't hear it directly, but the screenshots Mrs. Albright sent me said plenty. According to the neighborhood Whisper Network, and trust me, that network has better reach than any social media platform. The agent tore down his open house signs and stormed off the property in front of several neighbors. He accused Melody of almost costing him his license, and he demanded reimbursement for his marketing expenses, staging props, photography, listing fees. Melody didn't have the money, so he dropped her, publicly, no refund. Within an hour, all the photos of the house were scrubbed from his website, and within 2 hours, the first of Melody's empowerment coaching followers began commenting on her posts. Why did the listing disappear? Is the house still for sale? Why are you deleting comments? Are you being sued? Her page went dark not long after. Then came the social fallout. The neighborhood grapevine turned vicious. Not because people wanted to hurt Melody, most barely cared about her, but because drama travels fast in quiet cul-de-sacs. The story of her trying to sell a house she didn't legally own spread like spilled ink. One neighbor posted in a private community group, "Word is the Perry girl staged an open house illegally." Someone else chimed in, "Well, I'm not surprised. She always seemed like trouble." Enough comments were forwarded to me that I finally muted the group thread entirely. I didn't need to revel in it. I wasn't seeking humiliation for her. I was simply watching the truth unravel the fantasy she had built. And brutally, that fantasy didn't survive even a single week. The financial consequences. Next came the audit results. Samir and I filed for legal compensation for all the major expenses I had covered. The bathroom renovation, the winter heater repair, years of utilities, emergency roof patching, pest control visits, lawn equipment replacements. My financial contributions documented through bank statements. On top of that was the $22,000 retirement withdrawal. There was no version of events where Melody escaped untouched. The evidence was overwhelming. And in court, overwhelming evidence wins. She settled before it reached a judge. Melody had to pay me $500 in restitution, more than she had ever earned in any of her failed business ventures. The only way she could come up with the money was by liquidating what remained of her so-called wellness coaching fund, which turned out to be a combination of influencer sponsorship payouts and leftover customer deposits she'd never fulfilled. She was also legally required to submit a written acknowledgement to the court admitting she had misrepresented her ownership of the house during the attempted sale. That document became part of public record. There was no hiding from it, no spinning it, no angling it into self-pity online. Melody hated that more than the money. And what about our parents? The fallout hit them too. Without me covering the utilities, groceries, and emergency expenses they'd relied on me for, and without Melody getting the house transferred, they had to reevaluate everything. They ended up taking out a fresh mortgage on the property. Not a reverse mortgage, a real one with payments they couldn't comfortably afford. Mom called me about it. I let it go to voicemail. Dad texted me saying they could really use my help getting back on track. I didn't reply. They spent decades rewarding Melody's chaos and assuming I would fill in every gap. They built that system. They enabled it, and they never once acknowledged the cost to me. I wasn't going to salvage it for them. Not anymore. Melody's final attempt. Near the end of all this, Melody tried sending one last message from another number. Hope you're pleased. You destroyed my chances at a fresh start. You always hated that I got attention. You won. Happy now? I didn't block the number. I didn't respond either. I just let her words sit there hollow and desperate, revealing more about her than about me. She wanted to believe I did this out of spite. But spite is personal. This wasn't personal. This was structural, necessary. I had simply stopped carrying a weight that never belonged to me in the first place. And then there was quiet. Not peace. Not yet, but quiet. A quiet that didn't ache. A quiet that felt like clearing debris after a long, violent storm. A quiet that finally belonged to me. For the first time since childhood, my life had no demands I hadn't chosen, no unconditional caretaking, no emergencies that required me, no guilt tethering me to people who only saw my worth in what I could do for them. Melody lost the house. She lost her online persona. She lost her financial cushion. She lost the ability to twist herself into the center of our family narrative. But what she lost wasn't the real consequence. What she lost was access. And that far more than the house was something she would never get back. In the weeks that followed the settlement, my life took on a stillness that I didn't quite recognize at first. It wasn't silence born from retreat or fear. It wasn't the uneasy quiet you get before someone else's disaster becomes your emergency. This was different, like a room finally emptied of noise that had been echoing for so long you forgot it wasn't natural. I woke up without dread. I worked without distraction. I cooked dinner and ate it warm for once. I went to bed without waiting for someone to need something. And the strangest part was realizing just how foreign this all felt. Peace requires relearning. The first few mornings, I kept expecting a text from my mother asking if the electricity bill went through, or a voicemail from my father about needing help with appointments, or a frantic message from Melody demanding I fix something she broke. My phone stayed quiet, though, even after I changed my number and updated every point of contact. No more guilt-laced requests. No more last-minute emergencies disguised as responsibility. No more being the only adult in the family. With each passing day, the distance between us stopped feeling like abandonment and started feeling like relief. Still, healing is never linear. Some evenings, sitting alone in my apartment with warm light spilling across the quiet furniture, I'd catch myself grieving, not for them, but for the version of myself I'd been for so long. The Andrea who tolerated everything. The Andrea who apologized for existing. The Andrea who mistook survival for loyalty. She deserved better than the hand she was dealt, but she survived anyway. And now she was gone, and in her place stood someone who knew her worth. Therapy helped that transformation take shape. My therapist once told me that people who grow up in families like mine often mistake self-sacrifice for love. We think showing up for others is the same thing as being valued by them, but those two things can exist worlds apart. She asked me if you had known years ago that nothing you did would ever be enough, would you have stayed? I didn't need time to answer. No. And the truth of that settled in me like a closing door, quiet, firm, final. What happened to them? Word travels even when you're not listening for it. Through neighbors, through old acquaintances, through snippets overheard in grocery store aisles, I pieced together what happened after I walked away. My parents struggled with the new mortgage. Not catastrophically, but enough that they had to confront the consequences of decisions they'd made too easily. The safety net they'd relied on me was gone. Melody was no longer an option. She couldn't even stabilize her own life. Their finances tightened. Their routines changed. They moved through something resembling accountability, though I have no illusions they attributed that accountability to themselves. People who refuse to see their own patterns rarely wake up overnight. As for Melody, her downfall was public, brutally so. The written apology she'd been forced to submit to the court made its way through community circles, each retelling slightly more dramatic than the last. Her influencer feed, once filled with pastel affirmations and aesthetic brunch plates, went dark. Her coaching clients demanded refunds. Sponsors quietly severed ties. For the first time in her life, Melody had to face the consequences of her own actions. Consequences she couldn't charm, spin, or manifest her way out of. It didn't matter how many times she tried creating new accounts. The reputation followed. The miracle wasn't that she fell. The miracle was that I no longer cared. I didn't check her pages, didn't ask about her, didn't wonder whether she learned anything from all of this. Her life was hers, mine was mine, and they were no longer intertwined. The last thread cut. One night, months later, while I was journaling after therapy, a strange memory resurfaced. Something small, something I had forgotten. In the deed transfer paperwork I retrieved from the county office months earlier, buried deep in the scanned document was a final clause I hadn't fully processed at the time. A line stating that any attempt to transfer, sell, or leverage the property without resolving outstanding familial equity would render the entire filing void and assign legal priority to the most recent documented contributor. I remembered staring at that line when Samir first explained it. The most recent documented contributor, he'd said, is you. At the time, I didn't care. I didn't want the house. I still don't. That house is a museum of exhaustion for me. But the clause mattered for one reason and one reason only. My parents and Melody had built a future on the assumption that my work and contributions didn't count. Legally, financially, emotionally, they were wrong. In the end, the structure they built collapsed. Not because I destroyed it, but because they built it on a myth. The myth that I would always be there silent and compliant, carrying weight they never acknowledged. That myth died the moment I walked away. And that was the true ending, not the lawsuit, not the restitution, not the voided deed, or the public embarrassment. The ending was the moment they realized I would never be part of that cycle again. The final truth. People often think revenge is loud, dramatic, explosive, but the most powerful revenge is quiet. It's living a life free of the people who once treated your worth like a resource. It's letting them feel the absence of what they took for granted. It's choosing yourself so completely that the past no longer has claws. Melody lost the house. My parents lost their safety net. Their system collapsed. But what they lost wasn't the real consequence. The real consequence was me. And that more than money, more than property, more than legal wins is the one thing they'll never get back. I didn't become the villain in their story. I didn't become the hero either. I simply became free.